A Better World Blueprint. Good humans doing good things.
If you've a problem with doom scrolling, if the news you're consuming fills you with despair, you've come to the right place. A Better World Blueprint is all about providing balance to the shadows by shining a light on the people who are making the world a better place. Welcome. I'm Siobhan Hunt, and it's lovely to have you here. How often do you stop and reflect upon the things that have shaped your sense of self? Dr. Michelle McQuaid went through a rough time in her life where everything spilled out of the box, and what she discovered was her sense of self was governed by the ideal of the good girl. A researcher and honorary fellow at the Melbourne University Centre for Wellbeing Science, she wanted to know if her experience was reflected in the broader community. And the answer was yes, they did. So she wrote a book called The Perfectly Imperfect Little Girl Storybook. This is my chat with Dr. Michelle McQuaid. Hello, Michelle, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Siobhan, lovely to be with you.
What led you to this work that you're doing around ditching this good girl idea? What was your wake-up moment, if there was one?
Probably about 7 years ago now, I was going through a really challenging time. My father had recently passed away, and we'd had a very difficult relationship. It had brought up a lot of things with my mum, and we had grown up in a life, all of us, they were like 20, 21 when I was born, so they were growing up as well as me, where the first few years, particularly of my childhood, had a lot of trauma. My dad was an ex-Vietnam veteran, not long returned, having PTSD when we didn't know what PTSD was. He was coping with a lot of drugs and alcohol use, and that was leading to a lot of violence in our home. And it wasn't until he died that any of these things were talked about. It was like my parents got divorced when I was about 4, and then we put all that stuff in a box and nobody was to talk about it ever again. And as somebody passing like that tends to do, it suddenly opened that box all back up again. And all of these things sort of came emerging out. And I was working with a beautiful coach at the time, and she said, Michelle, it's nobody's fault. There's no one to blame here. Everybody did the best they could. But for much of your life, it's like the only love you've known has kind of been a bit like the dregs in the bottom of a barrel, that sort of sediment and, all the bits that get left behind. She was like, what would loving, in your marriage, with your children, in your friendships, working with people in your work, what would that look like if it was more top of the barrel loving? And this was such an interesting question to me because honestly at that moment I didn't know what that would look like. And she was like, well, it looks like healthy, mutual, respectful relationships. And as soon as those words came out of her mouth, I was like, I want more of that in my world. How on earth do I get it? And over the coming weeks and months, as we kind of began unpacking things, what started to become really clear to me was how so many of us, regardless of what it was like in our households growing up, are often groomed from an early age to be good girls in every form of relationship we have. So to try to perform perfectly so that we're ticking all the boxes and getting the pats on the head, trying to please others so that people will like us so we feel like we belong and are loved, and trying to protect other people from life's pain, often by silencing ourselves. And so as this it was a bit like a mist, Siobhan, sort of, like the mist was clearing across this valley of my life as I started to see both through that early trauma, but through school, through religious groups, through media. I mean, I grew up in the age of rom-coms and things like that this encouragement to be this good girl, this social expectation that I would perform perfectly, please others, protect everyone was so ingrained, and it was what was causing me so often to not go for that top of the barrel, healthy, respectful, mutual relationship where we all thrive.
There is so much in that. It's particularly when you talk about how ingrained it was in your own existence. I don't think it's new, this idea about the good girl complex, but I do think that actually feeling it in your body and understanding how it impacts your life is something that is the next step, and it's probably a step that many of us don't take. So keeping that in mind, how complex this realization is that you had, what did you decide to do with that? I mean, a lot of people it would just be a full-time job working out how to unpack it in their own lives. What made you decide to create this book that you've done, to build a program? How did you get to that point?
Yeah, well, first, Siobhan, I went to bed for a little while and pulled the covers over my head. And full permission for all your listeners to do the same. I definitely think you're right. There's this moment when that mist starts to clear and you start to see how pervasive this is, how in every part of our life, this often has taken shape and form, and then the consequences of it, right? And so for a little while there, I was like, oh my God, this is a lot, and I don't know what the heck I'm going to do with this. And while as much as I wanted to move towards more of those healthy relationships in every domain of my life, I was like, oh. And then I am a data nerd and researcher at heart. So I went back to what I know best. And I was like, well, is this just me? Is this just a Michelle thing? Or are other women struggling with this in the same way? And so I put an invitation out through my community and I said, look, we're going to start to run some research groups around these good girl behaviours and beliefs. And if this is something that resonates with you and you'd like to come and share your experience and hear the experience of other women, then, jump on Zoom for an hour and a half and, we'll see what comes out of it. And oh my goodness, like hundreds and hundreds of women signed up to give like 90 minutes of their very busy lives to come and have this conversation. And that was my first cue to kind of go, okay, there's something in this and a yearning for us. And then as we unpacked through a research process what those women were telling us, again, we saw it wasn't just me that was feeling that pressure to perform perfectly, to try to please others, to protect everyone, that actually this was happening on average for about 65% of the women. We've done big quantitative studies now as well, and we see this kind of number consistently. So, a little about 2/3 of us, right, are often feeling like, yep, I've got these expectations of society weighing down on me. Siobhan, to your point, we see it in women of all ages. Interestingly, it is most acute for our youngest generation. I was a bit like you, Siobhan, like as a Gen X woman, I was like, surely the younger generations are not getting this. It was just a moment in time that we were growing up through. That's not the case. Young women feel particularly pressured still to conform to these expectations. It gets most painful for us between the ages of 25 and 35. And when I say painful, the women in the research have been really clear about, look, this starts as kind of feeling exhausted, trying to do it all. It then leads to burnout, a sense of lost identity. I don't know who I am because I'm so busy twisting myself into the shapes for everybody else. And then also resentment about I'm doing this for everyone. Why is nobody seeing how hard I'm trying here? And of course, at the extreme, it leads to all sorts of unfortunate things, from addictive behaviours to eating disorders to suicidal ideation to finding ourselves trapped in domestic violence situations, to trapping us into poverty because we've been so busy looking after everybody else and appeasing everybody else, we perhaps haven't had the opportunities we need for our own financial well-being and the like. And so when this data started coming in, Siobhan, there was another moment where I have to say I went back to bed for a while and just went, oh my goodness, because now not only had my mist cleared, but I was starting to see the way that this ripples through the lives of women. The good news is in that research is as women get older, we start to see them, exactly as you were describing so beautifully before, Siobhan, starting to break free of some of these expectations and embody, was your word, to feel in their bodies. The way they described it was uniquely you. I'm being my unique self and I'm not apologizing for that. And so what was beautiful in there was the hope. And I do think part of it is as we get older and our hormones change a bit, we go through perimenopause and menopause, we definitely saw women who were 65 plus were the ones that cared least. They were still doing a bit of conforming, but they were done with it. They were like, you know what? This is me, take me or leave me. I'm over it now. And so I was really curious, like, what did they do that helped them break free from these societal expectations? And was it available to more of us besides just the hormonal change? Or did you have to wait for perimenopause? And this was the silver lining none of us have been told about. And so the good news was there were 3 skills we found in the research, and that was showing self-compassion, so being a wise and kind friend to ourselves like we are to everybody else rather than our worst critic. It was secure attachment to self. So often we might have heard about securely attaching to our parents, maybe our romantic partners, but what these women had done was kind of gone back and reparented themselves to say, you know what, I gotcha. I'll show up for you. I'll advocate you. It's all okay here. And then the other thing that they did was they were self-leading. And here they were using tools like internal family systems, which is a sort of therapy approach become quite popular the last few years. But in that approach, self is thought of as a capital S, like your self energy. And again, a bit like the wisest, kindest, best version of you, the you that's curious and creative and courageous and compassionate, and knowing that that is within all of us, but knowing how to access and cultivate that energy more, particularly when parts of us are getting triggered or old wounds that we're carrying from the past that still show up in ways, and knowing that there are no bad parts of us, but they're just some parts that are still learning and growing and need some extra love. And so that also gave me real hope. One, that change was possible, and 2, that there were these skills the women were using. And I've spent, 20 years sort of researching and playing with human thriving. And what I knew from those 3 skills also was that there was huge bodies of research that would support why those things might be having the impact for women. And so, Siobhan, it left me with that kind of, oh, okay, now how do I share this into a world in a way that hopefully does no harm, but helps other women clear their mist, and then find the hope and maybe invest a little energy and effort into building skills that might help them set themselves free and embody their unique selves.
There's so much again. There's so much in every answer. I love it. But if we can go back a step, this is just one of many books that you've written. And as you mentioned there, that you've done research in this area of human thriving. When it came to that realization of the Good Girl title that you felt had influenced your life, was that step to do research and to collaborate with others something that came from your professional background? And what I'm trying to drill down into here is what I'm finding is people have these ideas or epiphanies that resonate with them. They feel it deep in their heart. And what I'm trying to get into the weeds with is, once you feel that resonance in your heart, that message or that thing that you have to do that's going to make the world a better place, how do you realize it? And so in this case, it seems like you had a career and a professional background that could support you moving forward with this. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think, and having listened to many of the beautiful stories shared on your podcast, and the researcher in me can't help but look for the themes and the commonalities in the beautiful question that you're asking as well, Siobhan. I think part of it is always when you hear that call to your heart, the next thing you have to turn to is, well, what resources do I have to be able to take this into the world? And the good news is we all have some resources. We all have a beautiful set of unique strengths. We all have our own lived experiences to draw on. We're all part of communities that we can go and start talking and sharing this work with. So yeah, for me, one of my professional skills is I've spent 20 years researching and reading other people's research and thinking about how do you measure and then build the skills to activate more human thriving, whatever your gender, whatever your challenge is that you might be facing. So for me, the data nerd in me was straight to, where can I go and talk to other women, see if any of them are feeling the same way and what they're doing about that? Do any of them break free from it? And then how do I package that in a way that is practical and accessible and affordable for as many people to access as possible? And so that definitely was drawing on the professional resources and lived experience that I'd had.
And it seems that the important part there is what you're saying is, how do you, as an academic, make it accessible to others. I think that's probably a very common challenge for lots of academics. You just have to look at the world that you inhabit in the amount of data and the amount of knowledge you have. But you're trying to translate that into something that is consumable.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Siobhan. I wasn't an academic originally. I grew up doing marketing and communications, values, behaviour work in workplaces, trying to help people live company values and change their behaviours to be the ideal company citizens that the organisations I was working with. So behaviour change was where I started, fascinated me about how did you help people change behaviour. And then I wanted evidence-based ways that I could approach that so that I was ideally doing no harm. I was using knowledge we already had to help accelerate what people might know, to try and inspire their practices out of evidence-based ideas, and then give them the permission. Go pull this apart. You do what works in your world for your hopes, for your resources at this moment in time. And having done that a lot in different places, the question I used to always get, Siobhan, is, the insights and the ideas are great, but where's the stuff? And I'm like, what stuff? Where's the stuff? I think this is such an important insight for all of us hoping to help build change in the world. And what I figured out over time was the stuff was like, where are the little practices, the tools, the guided meditations, the little either mantras or things I can apply, the tiny habits or little nudges I can put in my world that will help me make this behavior shift. And so, again, for me, one of the joys has been, yes, I love my academic curiosity in the research, but for me, that's only half the pleasure. The second part is always, can I take that? Can I make it practical? And can I package it like we've done in the Perfectly Imperfect Women's Journal into little tools, nudges, habits, things that you can listen to, beautiful images you can put up somewhere as visual reminders. Can I put it into the stuff so that these change nudges will stay with you in your everyday world when life gets busy, when life gets hard, that it's right there in fingertip reach for you to grab?
This is all fabulous, and it sounds like you just steamed ahead because you had all of the research backing you up. You had women who were interested in the project. Was there ever a time that you stumbled during this process?
I've done a few of these similar projects more in the wellbeing general space now over the last 15 years. So it helped that it wasn't my first time out. Things that I had learned from previous times that helped a lot this time was to go and start with the research. In the past, I'd get excited about an idea that worked for my sample of one, and I'd want to take it out to the world and share it everywhere quickly. And I'd spend months kind of locked away building content and, pulling things together. And then come out, ta-da, it's here, you'll all be so happy and grateful. And of course it was crickets. Because nobody knew it was coming and nobody had been part of the conversations. And because I hadn't collaborated and consulted, it was still very much just my experience. And so while that may have resonated or been useful for some people, it was a bit limited. And again, for me, my guiding hope is always, as best I can, to do no harm, right? Which is a big ask, and that you unintentionally, of course, always at times may come out with pieces or a comment or just a bias or a privilege that you can't see and someone needs to point out for you. The beauty of having learned those lessons in past efforts meant that that's why this was so collaborative. It was also slow. I lean out there on the autism spectrum. So when I have a deep interest, my ability to hyper-focus and get something done is quite scary for everybody around me. Impressive from the outside looking in, but scary if you've got to live alongside it in any way. And so for me too, doing this over the course of a year is slow. I know that may not feel slow for everybody, whatever pace is yours to joyfully own. I highly recommend that. For me to do that, it was slow because I could have done it in about 3 months. So, to double that time, triple that time was an act of love. And it was interesting, just before I started this work, I had been on this will be the complete cliche, so my apologies up front, but I'd been on a hiking and yoga trip to the mountains in Nepal. And I sat on the mountain in Nepal I was like, universe, world, God, whatever it is that's out there, what next? Because I felt like I had done a lot of the things that I wanted to do in that professional space. And while I loved that and was so grateful for it, I also felt ready for a different creative challenge. And I didn't know what that was or where to go. Anyway, the mountain told me, Michelle, what's next is that you learn that success equals joyfully following what calls to your heart. And I was like, awesome, mountain. Thank you for your wisdom. I'm like, what does that look like exactly? Be a little bit more specific for me. I'm a details girl. And the mountain was silent. So I came down off the mountain, kind of go, we'll joyfully follow what calls to my heart. Sure, that's easy. And there were several months where I didn't know what the answer was, but I just kept coming back to what joyfully calls to my heart. And then I came across a book that I'd actually got when I was about 4 years old. My mother at that stage had divorced my father. She was a single mum, a school teacher. We didn't have a lot of money. But when you went to the weekly supermarket shop, if there was 40 cents left at the end of the shop, you got to buy a little golden book at the end of the checkouts. They cost 39 cents. So you had to have the 40 cents. And again, coming from a school teacher as a mother, this was considered a very precious gift. And on one of those occasions, I chose a book that I couldn't read the cover of. I was too young, but the picture was this hand-drawn little girl in the middle looking all calm and serene out to you, but around the edges were smaller pictures of the same little girl, and she's breaking a vase and pulling her sister's hair and her hand covering her face in shame. And those pictures were very familiar to me, Sean. And so I grabbed it. My mother at that stage, who was, emerging into quite a feminist, was, are you sure? Because this book was called Good Little, Bad Little Girl. And I was like, yes, this is it. Like, this is going to be my answer to how I be that little girl in the middle and not the little girl around the edges. And so I came across this book amongst these conversations. I'd rebought it on eBay years ago and stuck it in a cupboard as a therapy exercise. And this book comes out and I'm like, what feels like it would joyfully call to my heart would be to rewrite this story with what I wish it had been. And that was what sparked me then going and doing the research. If I rewrote it, what do women actually need to hear now? And so it kind of unfolded from there. But part of letting it be something that joyfully called to my heart was to intentionally not turn it into a business. I'm very good and experienced now going, right, we'll need to have revenue streams and we'll need to have branding and we need to have all these things. I was like, I'm not going to write a business plan for this. This isn't about the revenue. It was at a time in my life personally where finances were tight. So the idea that I'd pull back other work in order to make space for this thing that was unpaid was like, these were difficult choices. They were intentional. Definitely at times along the way I've gone, still the right choice to make when I've looked at the bank account and the mortgage. And I'm going, yes, there's something in every cell of my body that knows I will not live to the end of my life and regret the fact that I chose this moment to experiment with joyfully following what called to my heart, rather than feeling like success is going to equal how many books does it sell, how many followers are on Substack, how much money is this growing. And I appreciate the incredible financial privilege I've had to be able to juggle the space to do it this year. But I think the biggest aha for me through it all, Siobhan, and it's hard because, again, we get conditioned otherwise, is just to keep holding space for it to be this joyful piece of my heart and not a business enterprise that has to be achieving certain things in order for it to be considered successful.
And that's definitely something that's coming out with different people that I speak to in terms of how we define success when you are trying to affect change. Because surely if you just manage to speak to one woman and it changes their life, I mean, how huge is that?
It's huge. And even if not that, Siobhan, that it keeps changing my life in the process. And because we each are our own little ripples into the world, maybe that's all it even needs to do is continue to be that I chose to honour what joyfully called to my heart, regardless of what it looked like. And in choosing that throughout this process and beyond, that has created a different ripple of my energy in the world as well. But I agree, whether it's just you, whether it's that one other person that picks it up, I think it's just it's a shifting of collective consciousness that goes on when we make these choices.
Oh, that's beautiful. It almost gives me chills, only it's too hot in here for me to feel anything.
I love that.
I think you've just answered my next question, which was, has this work changed you? And what you just mentioned there is that it's consistently changing you.
Yeah, in so many ways, partly again in approach, in that it changed my idea of what success is. And has been an experiment for me. This year has been an experiment to go. And every now and then fear kicks in. It's like, you need a business plan. It's to like, look at the money going out and nothing's coming in. What are you going to do with this? And it's like, no, just breathe and know that whatever comes next, whether it's on this project or something else, the next thing is coming. And so, again, it's been a conscious choice to keep turning towards that space of love and abundance rather than fear and scarcity, which I think is hard for all of us. And I think living every day, thinking about these things, you can't help but spot it and play with it and experiment with it more yourself. Getting to talk to all the podcast guests and doing the researches, I learned so much and gained so many skills that I didn't have before this process, which I always love. And then, yes, as it's coming more and more out into the world, just, yeah, we hear such beautiful stories from women. And it's often starts with, Siobhan, oh my goodness, how did I not see this before now? And we're really careful to say whether you're a good girl or uniquely you, to us is not the point. To us, what we found through the research and tools was just trying to help women, see that there are this set of expectations, just as there are for guys on tough guys, and that if that's not serving you well, then you do have other choices as to how to show up. So we've tried to encourage people to think about on whose terms, for whose benefit, am I living my wild and precious life? And the answer to that is really just mine. It's all about my terms, my benefit, right? Because we're social creatures and we live in community. We want to be with each other. So it's normally an and in there. There's a bit of you and there's a bit of me and there's a bit of everybody else. But what it can't be is consistently at my cost. Because when it's consistently at my cost, which is what we see happening for so many women, and particularly between those ages of 25 to 35, where this seems to really bite with a lot of pain in terms of the impact on women's lives, it's not sustainable. And then what we hear so often are stories of women between 35 and 45 who have burnt out, who are exhausted, who are so angry at the people in their lives. And they're like, I don't know where to go. And then they start coming through perimenopause and menopause, and the chemicals change. And then it's like, right, stuff everybody. And I love all of that journey. And I think if there's anything that we can give each other that helps us have a bit more conscious choice and influence in that, so that it's a bit more on our terms and a bit more for our benefit along the way, then that to me is only goodness.
You've answered my question about the impact, I think, that you've seen the response from women. But I'm wondering if you have any specific examples you can give me of a woman or someone who's come to you and explained the difference this work has made to them.
Yeah, one of my favourite, and again, it's a story we hear several times, but we had a beautiful woman, Julie, that we were working with about 2 months ago in the community. And she'd come on and she'd listened to the podcast and was downloading some tools. And she came back to us and she said, I want to thank you for this work. It's changed. Now I can see it kind of everywhere and I can see it. I think the other thing that's important, we always say, is that, many people have propagated this set of expectations, not from a bad place. Often it's come from our own mothers and family members who have done it to try to protect us, believing that this is what we've needed to succeed in the world. And again, it's hard to believe, but it's just over 50 years ago that women in Western countries still needed a father or a brother or a husband to sign for us to get a bank account or a loan, right? Like that to me is just still blows my mind how short that amount of time is. So for our mothers and the mothers that came before them, they told us these good girl behaviours. They taught them to us to try to keep us safe because we depended on being compliant, particularly to men, in order to be able to have our most basic survival needs met of shelter and food and safety. And I want to just acknowledge still there are unfortunately so many parts of the world where that is still true today, including in many Western countries. So it's often this stuff has existed to protect us. Some people have propagated it to take advantage of us, but largely, again, it's come often, we find in the research, from family and friends. And often the hardest part of breaking free are family and friends because they're scared for us as they see us not conforming and being willing to just fit in at any costs. And so for Julie, she was like, number one, thank you for helping making visible what was invisible to me before. She said, thank you for helping me do that in a way that I'm not beating myself up about how stupid I've been for so long, but to help me understand the complexity of why it exists, to have compassion both for self and others in why it exists. But she said, the most important thing for me is as a mother of a 4-year-old girl, this has stopped me saying to my daughter, good girl. And she said, now instead, I praise her for, I love the way you thought about that, or, hey, look at you bending the rule on that, or that was really helpful, thank you. Why don't you take some time for you now to rest and recover? And she's like, it's changed the language of my parenting and hopefully what I get to pay forward to another generation of women. And that for me just lights my heart up with joy as to what would it have been for all of us as little girls if we perhaps had parents that understood that was the way to protect us rather than encouraging us to just conform.
Michelle, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
You are so welcome. Thank you for having me, Siobhan, and thank you for the change you're rippling into the world.
Dr. Michelle McQuaid, author of the Perfectly Imperfect Little Girl Storybook. Do you know someone like Michelle who's making this world a better place? Tell me about them. You'll find my email address in the episode notes. I'm Siobhan Hunt. See you next time on A Better World Blueprint.